Hi, I'm Trevor Stevenson, and welcome to Your Story Will Be Different. This is a narrative play podcast where I tell you the story that comes to be from a playthrough of a solo tabletop role-playing game. For this session, we're playing The Magus by Mamatos, in which you are an aspiring magical user who has to balance between control and power, often at the cost of sacrifice. Let's dive right in. Simon's life was unremarkable. The third son of a poor family, he had been apprenticed to the town blacksmith if only so his father could have some more income for drinking money. Days blurred together with the rhythm of hammer on anvil, and Simon found a sort of solace in the simple, predictable nature of his work. And it would have stayed that way, except one day, a horseshoe he was working on turned to solid gold. The transformation was so sudden that Simon dropped the glowing metal onto the forge floor. His master had raised his hand to slap Simon for dropping the shoe, but recognized a moment for his own gain. He snatched it up and dunked it in the water. The shop closed within the hour, and by week's end, Simon found himself dismissed.
"You're wasted here,"
the blacksmith had said. Simon wasn't sure, but he could have sworn there was fear in the man's voice.
"Go to the court. Let them make sense of what you are."
The royal court was one of the more lowly regarded in such circles. Accordingly, it wasted no time in claiming Simon. They sent him to the Lone Tower, which it turned out was a crumbling edifice on the outskirts of the kingdom. As he moved into his new, dusty home, he heard whisperings from the locals of a once great Magus who had abandoned the tower decades ago. No one knew why the previous Magus had left, only that he seemingly overnight went from a sleepy, quiet old man to a paranoid, wide-eyed recluse. Simon was surrounded by someone else's dust and the cobwebs of forgotten knowledge. At first, he felt more of a prisoner than a prodigy, isolated and bewildered. The tomes full of arcane secrets and vials of mysterious liquid were his only companions. He tried to make most of the situation at first by getting in some heavy reading. Though the books were filled with ancient runes that were inscrutable at first, Simon found himself inexplicably drawn to them. As the weeks turned into months, he learned the truth about magic. He was no ordinary talent, no innate spark to be kindled by practice and perseverance. He discovered that magic was a gift bestowed by strange gods, divine forces whose motives were as cryptic as their power was vast. Not everyone knew of the old gods, as their names had been lost to time. He read warnings about the usage of magic. The cost of wielding such power was high, taxing not only the body, but the soul. Simon's hands trembled after every experiment, and he noticed that his mind was weighed down by visions and whispers that lingered long after the spell had faded. The tower proved to have tunnels and alcoves that defied the knowledge of space and the structure of the building. One day, he found a large room whose walls were adorned by a faded tapestry of family trees. This was how he came to understand the wizarding families of renown. Unlike Simon, these families boasted centuries of arcane mastery, their lineage steeped in rituals and privilege. Simon's rise was an anomaly. He was a ripple in the tapestry fabric of the magical world. He knew that these families wouldn't approve of a commoner such as himself being blessed with abilities. Perhaps the Lone Tower was meant to keep him safe from these families, rather than keeping the townsfolk safe from him. Despite the weight of these revelations, Simon's curiosity was stoked even higher. In his mind, the tower became a sanctuary of possibility. Here, amid the crumbling stones and faded glyphs, he dared to dream of answering the questions of the universe. How could words create reality? What secrets lay in the space between stars? With every page he turned, Simon's ambition grew, though he had not yet learned of the looming shadow of its cost. On any given day, the tower was cold and silent. It was built to be a haven for the lonely and the curious. Yet in this isolation, the mundane concerns of life persisted. A leaky roof, an unstable stairwell, and a broken pulley for the well were issues that Simon couldn't solve with magic alone. Begrudgingly, he ventured into the nearby village. This was the first time he noticed that his presence was met with a mix of awe and suspicion from the locals. He did his best not to let these thoughts cloud his mind. But among the murmurs and sidelong glances, it was in this village that he met Shelby Clements. Shelby was a widow of middling years, her hair streaked with silver, her movements marked by a languid elegance. Her eyes held a spark of romantic idealism. She was weary, to be sure, but she still held a longing for meaning amidst the mundane. Shelby was a seamstress by trade, but possessed an uncanny knack for fixing things that seemed beyond repair. When Simon asked for her assistance with the tower's broken pulley, she agreed with an amused smile. Simon found Shelby's company disarming. She didn't pry into his magical studies or treat him with the deference he had come to expect from others. Instead, she treated him as a person. Over the days she spent at the tower, she shared stories of her late husband. She pondered aloud on her thoughts about love and loss. And Simon listened with an attentiveness that surprised even himself. In turn, Simon shared fragments of his life. His humble beginnings as a blacksmith's apprentice, the accident with the golden horseshoe, and his subsequent isolation in the tower. Shelby listened without judgment. She had gentle questions, encouraging him to reflect on the strange path his life had taken. Her guidance through the brambles of self-doubt, imposter syndrome, and loneliness were invaluable. For the first time in months, Simon felt connection to another human being. As the days turned into weeks, Simon found himself looking forward to Shelby's visits. She brought warmth to the cold tower, light to its shadows. Yet he couldn't ignore the growing unease within himself. His ambition, his hunger for more magical power, was a flame that burned brighter with each spell he learned. And he began to have small thoughts that maybe that same flame would one day consume everything. After months of visits, the lone tower was in wondrous shape. It was almost cozy, and Simon definitely felt it was his home. As Shelby prepared to leave for the last time, Simon felt a pang of loss. Alone once more, he turned back to the tower. With no other distractions, Simon returned to his studies. But his heart felt heavier. He knew the memory of Shelby's kindness would begin to dissipate like a distant, fading melody. Eager to prove his growing skill and curiosity, Simon turned to one of the tomes that had both fascinated and eluded him for weeks. It spoke of a spell called Twilight, described as a mysterious and subtle weave of magic capable of bending light and shadow to the caster's will. The implications of mastering such a spell sent Simon's mind racing with possibilities. Days of preparation followed. Simon studied the intricacies of the spell's incantation, its cryptic sigils, and the precise motions required to channel its power. The notes in the margin warned of these dangers, how the spell could misfire and create unpredictable outcomes if not executed with absolute precision. Simon dismissed the cautionary works, knowing that he wouldn't need to worry about such things. The tower was bathed in a serene glow as the setting sun painted the walls with hues of amber and gold. He had practiced ad nauseum to make sure he had every aspect ready, and tonight was the night. Simon stood in the heart of his workshop, a circle of runes etched into the stone floor before him. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves, and began the incantation. His voice resonated through the chamber and carried a melodic cadence that seemed to harmonize with the quiet hum of the world around him. For a moment, the spell worked beautifully. Light and shadow danced in intricate patterns, coalescing into a shimmering veil that enveloped the room. Simon was giddy with triumph. This was the definitive proof of his mastery and the promise of greater discoveries to come. But then, something shifted. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber as the spell faltered. Simon's concentration wavered, and the delicate weave of magic unraveled with violent intensity. A beam of refracted light struck the window, ricocheting off the glass and out into the world beyond. A distant cry followed, piercing and unmistakably human. Racing to the window, Simon's heart sank after he saw the aftermath of his mistake. A young villager lay crumpled on the ground. His arm was twisted at unnatural angles in multiple places. His cries of pain carried on the wind. Others gathered around the scene, their eyes lifting towards the tower with murmurs of fear and anger. Simon's breath quickened as the weight of his actions settled upon him. He had meant no harm to anyone, yet the consequences of his ambition were undeniable. The villagers would see him as a threat, and his standing with the royal court was in jeopardy. They might no longer see him as an asset, but as a dangerous sorcerer whose experiments endangered them all. As night fell, Simon sat alone in the dim glow of his workshop. The spellbook lay open before him at his feet. Wiping away his tears, he swore that he would learn from this. He had to. The path of the Magus was not one of retreat, but of relentless march forward, no matter the cost. The days following the Twilight incident were marked by unease. Simon noticed the shift in the villagers' attitude whenever he ventured into town. Whispers followed in his shadow, and wary glances met his every step. Along with the guilt gnawing at him, the isolation, which had once been a comfort, now felt oppressive. It was during one of these strained visits to the village that Simon first encountered Whistler Douglas. She was a popular community leader, known for her outward warmth, but shrouded in an air of mystery. Despite being perpetually hidden behind a pair of dark glasses, her eyes seemed to pierce through the soul of anyone who spoke to her. Simon couldn't tell if her smile was genuine or a carefully constructed facade. Their meeting was as chaotic as it was serendipitous. The royal court had sent Simon to mediate a dispute involving an irate farmer, an escaped chicken, and an unfortunate run-in with a member of the king's guard. The scene was a whirlwind of clucking, shouting, and clattering armor when Whistler arrived. With a few calm words, she diffused the situation. Her commanding presence and tone left no room for argument.
"You must be the wizard from the tower,"
she said afterward, turning to Simon with a raised eyebrow. Her tone was casual, but Simon detected a hint of curiosity beneath her measured demeanor. She removed a chicken feather from Simon's shoulder.
"I heard the rumors. It seems you made quite the impression."
Simon bristled, but managed a polite nod. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but I want to remind the court that I'm here to help however I can." Whistler studied him for a moment and then nodded.
"Good. We could use someone with your talents, provided you can keep those talents under control."
In the following weeks, Whistler became an unexpected ally. She had a knack for navigating the complexities of the court and the village alike. Simon found her connections and influence proved invaluable. Through her, Simon began to repair the damage of his reputation, though he remained wary of her inscrutable nature. With even more time, Whistler's own struggles began to surface. Beneath her composed exterior lay a deep resentment. Simon couldn't put his finger on whether it was toward her role, her past, or the constant expectations placed upon her. She confided in him sparingly, and their conversations were punctuated by moments of vulnerability that she quickly masked with her usual poise. But for Simon, Whistler was a resurgence of the power of human connection, flawed though it may be. Her guidance helped him regain a foothold in the world outside the tower, even as his ambition continued to burn within. With every new ability he learned, the hunger for power gnawed at Simon. It was a constant whisper at the edge of his thoughts, pushing him forward. Or maybe pulling him closer to some unseen goal. The events of the past months and years had shown him the fragility of his control and the limits of his strength. He needed more, not just to prove himself, but to protect what little ground he had gained. And so, he turned to the darker tomes that lined the shadowed corners of the Lone Tower's library. Among the cracked spines and the yellowed pages, Simon found a ritual, a means to summon a being from the realm of demons. The text warned of the costs, the risks, but Simon skipped over those passages. He prepared the circles with unsteady hands, inscribing runes that began to pulse on their own, faintly, in the dim light of his workshop. He chanted the invocation, but was unsure what exactly he would see. When a demon appeared, it was not the monstrous figure Simon had imagined, but a being of unsettling beauty. Its form was shimmering and fluid. Its eyes were dark as the void, and fixed on him with an expression that was almost amused.
You called me here, animal? What is it you seek?
Power. Enough to surpass my limits, enough to bend the world to my will. The demon smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, but too perfect.
And what do you offer in return?
Simon hesitated, and the weight of the question pressed down on him. He had assumed it would be here to grant a wish, not complete a transaction. He quickly did a mental inventory of his resources. He thought of the villagers, their fear and distrust. He thought of Shelby, her kindness was a fleeting warmth in the cold of his ambition. And he thought of Whistler, her enigmatic presence, a reminder of the human connection he could not afford to lose. His mind returned, unwillingly, to the fragile bond he shared with Shelby. A bond that now seemed distant, almost unreal. I offer a soul. Shelby Clements. The demon's laughter was a symphony of delight and cruelty.
A fine choice. The bargain is struck.
In an instant, the circle flared with light and the demon vanished. Simon felt the physical surge of power coursing through him. It was a rush of energy that left him breathless. But beneath the exhilaration was a gnawing emptiness, a shadow of regret he could not shake, and it grew every day. In time, Simon's newfound strength was undeniable. Spells that had once taxed him came with ease, and the whispers of doubt faded. But the cost lingered in the back of his mind. He now had a quiet reminder of the line he crossed, keeping him company in the tower. Redemption drove Simon to action. Despite the newfound ease with which he mastered spells, the lingering regret became unbearable. He barely slept. Desperate for answers, Simon pored over every tome in the Lone Tower, seeking anything that could ease his conscience, or, failing that, remove the feeling altogether. It was then he stumbled upon a fragment of text that mentioned a long-dead mage, renowned for her healing magic. The spell, Quiet Healing, was described as a panacea, capable of mending body and soul. But it had been lost for centuries, buried in the mage's hidden lair. The very mention of the lair ignited a spark of hope in Simon. Gathering what was needed, he set out on a grueling journey to the remote mountains far beyond the horizon of his home, where the lair had been hidden. The trek was arduous and even more challenging due to the many landmarks having disappeared with time. When he finally reached the lair, it was a crumbling ruin nestled within cliffs. Inside, Simon found remnants of the mage's life. Journals filled with elegant script, artifacts humming with echoes of magical energy, and the spell he sought etched into a tablet of stone. Translating the incantation from the runes on the slab took hours, but Simon's excitement grew as he deciphered the ancient carvings. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. Simon stood in the lair's center, the tablet before him. He recited the incantation, feeling the familiar surge of power course through him. But something was wrong. The magic twisted in his hands, and the spell misfired. Agony ripped through Simon as crystalline shards grew from his spine and out of his back. His skin turned gray and then a shiny black as it hardened. His veins turned gold and stretched over his body as the mutation spread like wildfire. Simon collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The lair, the mountains, and the world itself seemed to mock him with its silence. The spell was his only hope, and it had failed. Not only that, but the consequences were worse than he could have ever imagined. When he finally emerged from the lair, the sun blinded him with callous indifference. The journey home was a blur, each step weighed down by despair, granting him eons of time to reflect on his failing and his journey. As the lone tower found its way into his view, he vowed that these failures had not broken him completely. If quiet healing could not save him, he would find another way. The aftermath of Simon's journey to the mage's lair left him more isolated than ever. His failed attempt at redemption haunted him, and his mutations made even simple human connections seem impossible now. But it was in this moment of darkness that a spark of light appeared in a boy named Bartholomew. Simon first encountered Bartholomew on a foggy morning outside the lone tower. He was no older than 12. But Simon found him as he stood at the base of the tower, gazing up with wide, curious eyes. His clothes were tattered, and his cheeks were smudged with dirt. Simon felt a pang of sympathy, thinking of his own youth all those decades, maybe centuries before. But Bartholomew's expression was one of awe rather than fear. Simon watched him from the tower's shadow, hesitant to approach. But when he finally stepped forward, Bartholomew did not flinch or flee as others might. Instead, he grinned.
Are you the wizard who lives here?
Simon nodded slowly. I am. Why are you here, child? Bartholomew's grin faded slightly, replaced by a seriousness beyond his years.
They say you're powerful.
Simon would have shrugged if the crystals in his back would have let him.
I need your help.
After a moment of silence, scowling to make sure the boy hadn't been assigned to perform some cruel prank, Simon gestured for the boy to follow him inside. As they climbed the spiral staircase to the workshop, Bartholomew explained his plight. His mother had fallen gravely ill, and no healer in the village could save her. He had heard stories of Simon's magic, both wondrous and terrifying, and believed the wizard was his last hope. Simon's heart sank with heaviness as he listened in silence. The boy's story struck a chord with him, stirring memories of the innocence he had lost in the pursuit of power. He wanted to help, yet he still feared what his magic might do. In the workshop, Simon prepared a simple healing spell, one he was abundantly confident would ease the woman's suffering. As he worked, Bartholomew watched with wide-eyed fascination, asking questions about the runes and the incantations. Simon found himself answering in his guarded demeanor, softening in the boy's presence. The spell was completed without incident, and Simon gave Bartholomew a vial of enchanted glowing liquid to take to his mother. The boy thanked him profusely as he began for the stairs. He stopped in the doorway and turned back, with a serious expression on his young face.
You know, you're not what they say you are. You're a good man.
For days after Bartholomew's visit, Simon felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, since before he went off to find quiet healing. He had hoped the liquid for Bartholomew's mother had worked, though he dared not venture to the village to find out. When Bartholomew returned, his smile was proof enough.
She's better,
the boy announced, and threw his arms around Simon in an impulsive hug. Simon froze, worried that the boy would hurt himself on his craggy body, but slowly returned to the embrace. He felt a glimmer of something he had thought long lost in the tower. Hope. Bartholomew began visiting the tower regularly, peppering Simon with questions about magic and life in the tower. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and Simon found himself looking forward to the visits. But Simon's mutations remained a constant reminder of his arrogance and recklessness. One afternoon, Bartholomew asked about the crystals that jutted from Simon's back.
Are they part of your magic?
Simon hesitated, then knelt to meet Bartholomew's gaze. They are a reminder of the price of magic. I never had anyone to teach me of such things, and I paid the price for not listening to warnings. Bartholomew frowned.
But you're helping people now.
Bartholomew's faith in him was unflappable, and though Simon knew the boy's innocence and understanding of magi might one day be tested, he vowed to protect it for as long as he could. Simon had found a connection in Bartholomew that began to mend the fractures in his soul. The boy's laughter echoed through the tower, filling its once silent halls with life. One unremarkable evening, the tower stood silhouetted against the setting sun, its ancient stones glowing softly in the twilight. Simon lingered on its edge, his crystalline back catching the last light and scattering fractured rainbows on the ground, and the gold in his veins glowed brilliantly. This place had been everything to him: a sanctuary, a prison, a crucible for his ambition, and a stark witness to his greatest mistakes. Yet now he knew it was time to let go. Adjusting the strap of his weathered satchel, Simon took one last look at his home. Its imposing visage was once a comfort in its solitude, but now it felt hollow. He knew it could no longer be his refuge. The power he had pursued so fervently had come at a steep cost, and though he carried the scars of his failure etched into his body and soul, he knew that he had to resolve to forge a different path. His eyes turned to the horizon, where villages, cities, and untold lives awaited. Behind him, the shadows of the lonely tower were long and solemn. But in one of the highest windows, a small figure watched as Simon grew smaller against the fading light. Bartholomew stood clutching a tome Simon had entrusted him. The boy had shown an earnest curiosity and strength of heart during his visits. Simon had sensed something rare in him, a spark that could grow into something extraordinary. The boy opened the book carefully, as if it might crumble in his hands. A single note slipped from its pages, carried briefly by the wind before he snatched it. Pinned in Simon's painful hand, the note read, "Bartholomew, the world needs those who can wield power wisely and with compassion. Learn from my mistakes and follow your own path. Grow beyond my own limitations. Perhaps one day, this tower will be yours." Bartholomew reread the words over and over, his fingers tracing the ink as if to anchor their meaning. He looked around the tower and noticed its stones now glowing faintly in the blooming moonlight. As the doors creaked shut below, the ancient hall seemed to settle into a watchful silence, waiting for the next Magus. I had actually planned on doing this game for this season, and then the other day I was scrolling through Polygon and saw that there was an article about the most heartbreaking solo TTRPGs you can play, and guess what? This was on it. One of the incredible aspects of it is the need for a balance of power and control, and that's actually a mechanic that's built into the game itself. You have the ability, based upon your roles and how it goes, to either increase your power at the loss of control or maintain your control and forge bonds with other people around you. And of course, those bonds are the sacrifice that you'll end up making in order to gain more power. It was an interesting dichotomy to play with and to imagine. And the game itself is fantastically made, I have to say. There were a lot of elements in it that were inspiring to me, and this dark investigation into unbridled ambition versus maintaining your relationship with others and keeping that human aspect of yourself. There are multiple ways you can play this game. You can go full tilt in this game and just go straight for the power. And effectively, if you make your way all the way to the end of the game, you're essentially a god. You're omnipotent and omniscient, essentially. And you go to, I guess, the next level of consciousness because there's no need for you for any earthly ties. My playthrough didn't end up that way. I was a little bit more cautious because one of the things that I was terrified about when I was playing this is that should you cast a spell and not have the proper amount of control, there is a very real possibility of creating a cataclysm that might destroy the entire world or people you know or various things around you. So that was something that I kind of pumped the brakes when it came to gaining power. It's a fantastic game, I have to say. Check it out for yourself. Thank you again for listening to Your Story Will Be Different. If you want to help support the podcast, the best thing you can do is to leave a review on your platform of choice and tell someone. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter, and Blue Sky. And if you've got a digital dollar burning a hole in your pocket, feel free to skip over to coffee.com/yourstory. That's ko-fi.com/yourstory to just throw in $1. As always, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to The Magus by Mama Toes. Reach out on those social media channels and let me know how your adventure as a Magus goes, growing in power. Just remember, your story will be different.